The Elizabeth, a classical education for the modern man. Lecture 20. Rome as history, the machinery of power. Everything we have read so far in this course has assumed a background that we have not yet made fully explicit. Cicero's letters assume that you know what a consul is and why losing the consulship matters. Plutarch's Lives assume that you understand what the Senate was and why Caesar's relationship to it was the central drama. The Aeneid assumes that you feel the weight of Roman destiny as something more than a poetic abstraction. In this lecture, we lay out the structural history, the constitutional and social machinery of Rome from the early Republic through the Augustan settlement, so that everything you have already encountered can be understood not merely as literature and biography, but as the record of a specific civilization at specific moments of stress. Rome as constitutional history spans roughly 1,000 years. If you begin with the traditional founding date of 753 before the Christian era and end with the deposition of the last Western emperor Romulus Augustus in 476 of the Christian era, we are concerned in this lecture primarily with the middle period, the Republic from roughly 509 to 27 before the Christian era, and the early empire from Augustus' assumption of power in 27 to roughly the end of the 2nd century. A period that produced the literature. The Roman Republic was not a democracy, and it would have found the description puzzling. It was a system designed to prevent any single individual or family from accumulating the kind of absolute power that the Tarquin kings had exercised, and it achieved this through a set of constitutional mechanisms. The two consuls who held supreme executive power were elected annually, held office simultaneously, and each had the power to veto the other. This collegiality principle ran through the entire magistracy. Every significant office was held by at least two men simultaneously, specifically to prevent the concentration of power. The cursus honorum, the sequence of offices through which an ambitious Roman moved from quaestor to aedile to praetor to consul, was rigidly regulated by age requirements and intervals between offices. You could not rush it. You could not skip steps. The system was designed to slow the accumulation of individual authority at every point. Above the annual magistrates sat the Senate, which was not an elected body in any straightforward sense, but a council of former magistrates, men who had held public office and thereby earned lifetime membership. The Senate did not pass laws. It issued decrees that carried enormous moral authority and practical weight, without being legally binding in the way that legislation passed by the. This distinction between senatorial authority and popular sovereignty was one of the productive tensions at the heart of the republican system. And it was the tension that the populares, the political faction that Caesar and before him the Gracchi represented, exploited in their various attempts to bypass the senatorial establishment by going directly to the people. The popular assemblies were several, and their constitutional functions differed in ways that specialists dispute and general readers need not master in detail. What matters for our purposes is that the Roman people, in theory, were sovereign. Laws were passed by the people in assembly. Magistrates were elected by the people in assembly. This popular sovereignty was real in a technical constitutional sense and considerably less real in practice because the assemblies voted in units whose composition systematically advantaged the wealthy, and because the practical management of Roman political life was conducted by the senatorial class in ways of the popular assemblies. The tribunate of the plebs was the institution that provided the constitutional mechanism for popular resistance to senatorial dominance, and it was therefore the institution that the optimates, the conservative senatorial faction, most resented and most feared. The tribunes were elected by the plebeian assembly, held the power to veto any act of any magistrate, including the consuls, and their persons were sacrosanct, meaning that any physical interference with the tribune was a capital religious offense. Tiberius Gracchus, who attempted to use a tribunate in 133 before the Christian era to redistribute public land to the poor and was beaten to death by senators in the Forum, discovered that the sacrosanctity of the tribune's person. The Republic's constitutional mechanisms depended on the willingness of all parties to observe them, and when one party stopped observing them, the mechanisms had no enforcement power of their own. This is the central structural weakness of the Roman Republic, and it is a thing that the 100 years of crisis from the Gracchi to Augustus exposed with increasing violence. The constitution worked when everyone agreed to make it work. It had no independent enforcement mechanism beyond the collective willingness of the ruling class to observe the rules it had itself. When individuals of sufficient ambition and sufficient military resources decided that the rules were optional, the rules became optional. Marius did it, Sulla did it, Pompey did it, Caesar did it more completely and more successfully than any of them. And when he was killed, the lesson the episode taught was not that the rules had been restored, but that the next man, Augustus, was more careful. The constitutional settlement he constructed after Actium was a masterpiece of political architecture precisely because it preserved the forms of the Republic while systematically hollowing out their content. The consuls continued to be elected, the Senate continued to meet and deliberate and issue decrees. The tribunes continued to exist and to ensure. The popular assemblies continued to convene. All of this continued, and none of it mattered in the way it had mattered before, because Augustus held the tribunician power permanently, which gave him the veto over everything and the sacrosanct person of a tribune, without the need to be elected tribune annually. He held proconsular authority over the frontier provinces where the armies were stationed, which meant that the armies were loyal to him. He had the title princeps, first citizen, which was not a constitutional office, but a social position of such overwhelming preeminence. He was, in every practical sense, the sole ruler of the Roman world, and he achieved this while allowing everyone to maintain. The genius of this settlement was that it addressed the actual problem the previous century had been generating. The problem was not that Rome lacked republican institutions, it had them in abundance. The problem was that the republican institutions had proven incapable of managing an empire of the size Rome had acquired. The two annual consuls and the Senate were adequate governing machinery for a city-state and its immediate territories. They were not adequate governing machinery for a domain stretching from Britain to Mesopotamia, requiring continuous military campaigns on multiple frontiers, simultaneously managing an administrative complexity that no collective body of annual magistrates could handle with sufficient continuity. Augustus understood this and provided the solution, which was a single continuous executive with sufficient authority to manage the empire as a whole, dressed in republican costume to avoid the psychological difficulty of admitting what it actually was. This is not cynicism. It is political intelligence of a very high order, and the result, the Pax Romana, the 2 centuries of relative peace and administrative competence that followed the Augustan settlement, justifies the method by its consequences. The populations of the empire, the millions of people in Gaul and Spain and North Africa and the eastern provinces who had no particular investment in whether Rome's executive was called a consul or a princeps, experienced the Augustan system. The civil wars of the late Republic had been catastrophic for them. The stable imperial administration that Augustus created was, from their perspective, an unmixed improvement. The succession problem was the empire's structural weakness from the beginning, and Augustus never solved it. Though he tried repeatedly, he had no son. He worked through a series of adopted heirs, several of whom died before him, and finally settled on his stepson Tiberius, who was capable but personally disagreeable, and who was chosen not because he was the best available man, but because he was the last man standing after a series of deaths that ancient sources found suspicious, and modern historians find genuinely ambiguous. The Julio-Claudian dynasty that followed Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius Nero produced the full range of what hereditary power can generate, from the merely difficult to the genuinely dangerous, and the system had no reliable mechanism for removing a bad emperor that did not involve either assassination or civil war. This was understood at the time. It was not solved for another century when the adoptive emperors of the 2nd century, Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, each adopted his successor on the basis of capacity rather than bloodline, producing the most consistently well-governed period in the empire's history. Marcus Aurelius then made the mistake of having a son, Commodus, which ended the adoptive experiment and produced another, Caligula. Gibbon characteristically noted that Marcus Aurelius had the good sense to choose all his predecessors and the bad luck to choose his successor in the usual way. The social structure that underpinned all of this constitutional machinery is worth understanding in outline because it shapes everything in the literature we've been reading. Roman society was organized around a hierarchy of legal statuses that determined what a person could do, who they could marry, what offices they could hold, and what courts had jurisdiction over them. At the apex were the senatorial families, perhaps 600 families at any given time, who held the highest offices and owned the largest estates. Below them were the equestrians, the business and financial class from which Atticus came, wealthy and influential, but excluded by convention from the highest magistracies. Below them were the freeborn citizens, last middle of Roman society, who held full legal rights but limited political access. Below them were the freedmen, former slaves who had been manumitted and held a modified citizenship. And below them, outside the legal protections of citizenship entirely, were the slaves, who in the late Republic constituted perhaps a third of the population of Italy. The slave economy is the fact about Rome that the classical education traditionally handled with some delicacy, and the Elizabethan frame this course has maintained does not require us to moralize about it from a modern position. But it does require us to understand it as a structural feature that shaped everything else. Cicero's household ran on slave labor. His letters were carried by slaves. His books were copied by slaves. The agricultural estates, whose income supported the senatorial class, were worked by slaves, many of them prisoners of war, from the very campaigns that Plutarch's generals are celebrated for winning. The Roman economy and the Roman culture were built on this foundation and cannot be understood without it. When Terence writes his comedies and gives his slaves the most intelligent lines, he is doing something with a specific social charge that the Elizabethan audience, living in a society with its own rigid hierarchies and its own populations of the Roman world, was also a world of intense religiosity of a very particular kind. Roman religion was not primarily about personal belief or individual salvation. It was about the correct performance of public ritual, the maintenance of the Pax Deorum, the peace of the gods, through which the city secured divine favor for its collective enterprises. The priestly offices were held by magistrates and aristocrats as part of their public careers, not by a separate clerical class. Julius Caesar was Pontifex Maximus, chief priest, at the same time that he was general and eventually a dictator. The religious and the political were aspects of the same public life, and the elaborate calendar of sacrifices and games and festivals was as much a political institution. This gives Roman religion a quality that the Christian reader, whether Elizabethan or modern, finds somewhat alien. The Roman gods are not primarily concerned with the moral conduct of individuals. They are patrons of specific activities and specific places who can be propitiated by correct ritual and offended by its neglect. Ovid's treatment of the gods, which we discussed in the Metamorphoses module, is not irreverent in the way it might appear to a reader. It is treating the gods as the Romans actually experienced them, as powerful, capricious, magnificent, dangerous, and thoroughly uninterested in the moral development of the humans they occasionally noticed. Augustus's religious program was one of the most sophisticated aspects of his political settlement. He restored temples, revived lapse ceremonies, appointed priests to colleges that had been left vacant during the civil wars, and positioned himself as the restorer of Roman religion as part of his broader program of restoring Roman tradition. The new temples he built and the new cults he promoted, including the imperial cult that would gradually develop into the worship of the emperor as divine, were continuous with Roman religious tradition rather than a break from it. The deification of Julius Caesar that Ovid celebrated in the last book of the Metamorphoses was not propaganda dressed up as religion. It was religion doing what Roman religion had always done, which was to consecrate political reality in divine form. This is the world behind the text, the world of the annual magistracies and the senatorial debates and the popular assemblies and the slave households and the religious calendar and the military commands and the provincial governors, the world that Cicero navigated and Plutarch described and Virgil mourned and Ovid survived. Understanding its structure does not reduce what the literature does with it. It enables you to hear the full resonance of what the literature says. The way knowing the rules of a musical form enables you to hear what a composer does when he follows them and what he does when he breaks them. In our next lecture, we look at how the Elizabethans read this world and what they made of it, the political uses of Roman history in an age when Roman history was the only political science available that anyone of education was prepared to take seriously. End of Lecture 20.